There's one place in chapter 3 where Freud refers to something called linguistic feeling, and he remarks, and remember, he's in a quandary here because he's trying to talk about something for which there is no direct demonstration. And he writes, we shall have no hesitation in letting ourselves be guided by linguistic usage, or, as it is also called, linguistic feeling, in the conviction that we shall thus be doing justice to inner discernments which still defy expression in abstract terms. Okay. So, we might think that, our task is to extract the philosophy from Freud, but he's saying, no, wait. There are sometimes ways of using language, like linguistic usage, that furnish or are linked with linguistic feeling that allow us inner discernments that still meaning historically, or maybe forever, defy abstract terms. And there is a kind of questioning whether abstract terms can ever get there, or why not. And then, of course, it's at the end of chapter 7, after another poetic foray into Goethe, and there are several here. He writes, we may well heave a sigh of relief at the thought that it is nevertheless vouchsafed to a few to salvage without effort from the whirlpool of their own feelings, and I think it is Gefühle, the deepest truths towards which the rest of us have to find our way through tormenting uncertainty and with restless groping. So this is actually allowing poetic language to have a relationship to this undemonstrable drive that philosophical abstraction cannot have, or not yet, or he's still groping, right, toward that language. But he thinks perhaps others do not. And I'll turn it to you.
Thank you. I'll just say a few words and encourage your jump-ins. So you just heard that Freud ascribes something, not something like, but the deepest truths to the poetic word. That in itself is a revolution, right? We just saw how he taps around and trips up and walks the walk. I say that because in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, everything is a matter of the Schritt that needs to be taken and the walks, and we will discuss elsewhere, or we will, what walking and philosophical thought mean, especially here in the Alps, where Nietzsche's walks are still resonating and reverberating. So that's a kind of displacement that we want to be attuned to. Also understanding that when Heidegger wanted to say being, which cannot be a direct hit or an address, he also took recourse to the poets, because Hölderlin saw, so to speak, being. A philosopher can't see being or say that that is something that was seen. Exactly what was just said in terms of what doesn't phenomenologically fly, what doesn't show up on any radars, and what is off the charts of something you could show, demonstrate, theorize, is sometimes what the poets already knew. But this already and priority and a priority is something that invests this text. It turns out that guilt comes before. Mm-hmm. So here we need to take the Heideggerian, sorry for those who get hives, the Heideggerian Rückschritt, which is a back step, or not a backslide, but stepping back. which is very important in the way Heidegger detours his texts, to take a step back. This is something I'll just leave in suspension right now. So for Freud before I go there, let me just say when I was invited to say a few words about Goethe's insertion in this text, and what kind of a penetration is this, and where does it go? Which orifice is opening up to Goethe? He's the phallus. This is, if I open up to you as I'm trying to birth my field, my text, my signature, and you impregnate me, but you were prior to me, all of these tropologies are authorized by the way, and I'm just giving you a fast forward on and I apologize for that, a drive-by. Maybe you can give me credit, and again I'll say, which has become a little repetition compulsion, I've done the archival labor camp, and if you can believe that that Goethe becomes all of these things. What does it mean when you call for the one who holds the deepest truth? And think of the metaphorology of depth here as well. It's deep, it's deep. Everything else has been walking and skimming the surface here, So when I was invited to say a few words now on the Goethean incorporation by Freud, or invitation issued, or hospitality or shelter shown to Goethe, I said yum. Now, I don't know if you wrote that down in your important notes, but that was determined and driven by a whole archival commitment to what it means to incorporate, to eat the other, to meet and eat and greet alterity. Once Derrida said, trying to provoke me, I think, that vegetarians just don't love the other enough. Because if you really love the other, you want to eat them up, right? Little children, do you know the great psychoanalyst, post-Freudian, Maria Tarak?
Yeah.
She had a patient, a little boy, who had all sorts of symptoms we don't have to go into right now, but it turned out she traced it back to the signifier moment where everyone who saw him not only would go like this, talk about aggression and love to a child, also the way people think they can touch pregnant bellies and children and, oh, you're so cute, practically tearing their faces off. It turned out that people would say to this child, I want to eat you up, in French, you're a croquet, yum. And so the child couldn't eat and was afraid of being consumed by the other, being devoured. So this devoration, which is part of adoration, and the cannibalistic, the oral cannibalistic libido, is part of perhaps the series of drives that lead one to incorporate or interiorize or eat the other, to make you part of my body or take my body and have that part of your textual body. These are bodies we're always thinking that matter in all sorts of ways. So that's what I meant very quickly, the difference between interiorization in psychoanalysis and incorporation is a big one, or introjection, let me say. Interiorization is more philosophical. Introjection, perhaps a more comfortable internalization of the other. Incorporation, a kind of failed assimilation, where the other is what, and this is very important to so-called French theory, the other is a foreign body. What's great about a foreign body, which which I've always identified with until I could finally get a job, is that it can, and of all people, Paul DeMont said to me, go to California, go west, young man. And because they have a system called the UC system that won't be able to excrete or vomit you. I go, thank you. You can be a foreign body. And I went first to Riverside.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Those were, well,
Just
you
'cause
went to
there's
Johns
no-
Hopkins.
Yeah, but there's no air in Riverside.
No, that's the most, if that were in Europe, people would be demonstrating on the streets. It's so polluted, okay, forget it.
Yeah, okay.
No, you can't teach for more than an hour. You get respiratory disease, and you have to take like 4 showers a day. Okay, I'm done with Riverside, thank God, praise the Lord. So the California, UC California system is such a system that it can host a parasite, said Paul DeMont. And the great thing about the foreign body is that it can't be ejected and it can't be assimilated. It's not like I became Miss California suddenly, like this one. So that system has a kind of hospitality that can host consensual parasites, or it has a certain kind of hosting policy or admissions policy that doesn't let you in, but doesn't throw you out. Perfect housing project for this one. So is Goethe a foreign body? Is he the deeper truth? Is he introjected? Now, as was said, he's the paternal metaphor. A father, as Freud himself, and this is what's weird about the texts we're reading here. Freud himself and Lacan jams on this, says you can't prove a father. There is no father, psychoanalytically speaking. And Freud also has a very peculiar footnote in the case of obsessional neurosis. He said when matriarchy got stomped out and patriarchy installed itself, that was a big day for speculative thought. What that means and it seems like very offensive, but it's a big, what it means, to say it too quickly, is that once patriarchy dominated the horizon, everything had to be maybe full of detour and doubt, which is what he practices, rather than the sense certainty of the matriarchal in the Freudian understanding. And it just comes down to the banal example of you know who the mother is. There's, of course, a French-Belgian joke where, you want me to tell it to you just so this is illustrated, or do you not need jokes here? Go ahead. Okay. So at the family table, the boy said, okay, I have something to tell you, Mom, Pa, I'm sorry about this, but we have to get through this together. I got my girlfriend pregnant. Silence. The father said, come to my study. And he said, it's a Belgian joke. In America, it would be a Polish joke. Okay, whatever. And so the father said, honey, are you sure she's the mother? You see, sure, of course you're sure. With matriarchal structuring, you're sure. Once patriarchy comes in, you're not sure who's the father. I don't want to talk about the contingencies of DNA and all that right now. But there's speculation, there's non-knowledge, there's uncertainty. You can't know, you can't be sure for real, okay? And everything that involves the imaginaire. So this is what Freud meant, that was a complete upheaval, or what Nietzsche would call a transvaluation of values. Our relation to world from now on is we're not sure. We don't have ground under our feet when women aren't running the show. And you know that's true, right? So for Freud to have chosen Goethe, whether or not the paternal can ever be fixed, is not an innocent or neutral gesture. I'll just say it in 2 seconds. Freud says that psychoanalysis itself was conceived in his ear when he was 18 years old. 18 for Freud is a very invested number, as it is for the Kabbalah. When he heard a public lecture a public reading of a Goethe text, and he said it was like his ear was penetrated. This is, by the way, how the Madonna is said to have conceived, right, through the ear. This was the Annunciation for Freud. This was the paternal moment. By the way, you do know that Nietzsche said that Lou Salome impregnated him with the thought of the eternal return through the ear. So this is the place of impregnation. Nietzsche, of course, was always expecting and always pregnant, and that's another pregnancy that we'll leave to the side and for its own term. But so Freud was impregnated by Goethe, and this is when psychoanalysis traumatically entered his body, by the way. It wasn't an easy transfer, to quote Evan right now. It was a persecutory invasion and body invasion. So one of the questions could be, just to move it along here, what happens when Freud calls in the tropes or troops that are assigned Goethe? Is that a super-egoical invasion? Here's the law. But one thing that we do want to, again, be very aware of is that Goethe knew prior to psychoanalysis what the truth of psychoanalysis would and must be. So Goethe knew prior, and all the priorities and a priorities is something we need to think about in these texts. But if Goethe knew what kind of positionality, that word was used earlier, what kind of placement or displacement does that involve? What does it say about the theoretical stakes? What is the relationship of Freud to Goethe? But if Goethe knew, that also means that there's a kind of achronicity that I'd just like you to be aware of in the relation of text, because that also means that Goethe comes after psychoanalysis. Goethe is already the commentary and the critique and the knowledge of psychoanalysis, the access code to psychoanalysis that psychoanalysis itself doesn't have. It doesn't have access to its own knowledge. That's why it's like tripping up and detouring. But there is someone that knew, or something that knew, and that is understood by the signifier Goethe, who knew, who knows, who holds some keys, and who was able to say what Freud cannot say. At the same time, that means that Freud is birthing Goethe for the first time, because if the truth of Goethe is psychoanalysis, and Goethe knew the secret of the superego, because this is about superegoical formation here, then Goethe had to wait until Freud birthed him and said, now bring me some meaning and some sense. Now you can sign. And it's almost a Nietzschean double signature that you need. Now I affirm your signature, and now your signature becomes original, because I, Freud, have brought you to life. I have given meaning. You invented the superego, but no one knew that until I read you and included you in my readings of an invention, which is original, but couldn't have happened without you. So there's a whole mountain of deconstructive magnetism. Like, Freud is only original to the extent that he needed to borrow or birth or follow Goethe. But Goethe doesn't exist before Freud, because the truth of Goethe is psychoanalysis. So if we look just here, where we stopped earlier. So the end of chapter 7. One is reminded, do you see that, of the great poet's moving arraignment of the heavenly powers. Do you see that? Does anyone see it? Ihr führt ins Leben uns hinein. In my version, it's a misspelling. There's suddenly apostrophe parachuted in ins. Maybe that was clear in yours. So
No,
it's in yours. So that's a fuck up that I like to go into the micrological problems, like what is that apostrophe doing there? But that would take us 3 weeks, so I'm just going to point it out, right?
Yeah.
Ihr führt ins Leben uns hinein. You may think you don't know German, some of you, but you do. So this is the birth of everything that we've been talking about, guilt. Right? By the way, a beautiful word that would bridge and span Levinas and Freud and doesn't exist in French or German, I think, is liability. To have a liability or be liable to do something is not yet guilty, but it's almost a predisposition, right? It's an almost inclination toward being guilty, which is really very astonishing moment in the English language. Liability. Do you have anything?
I'm thinking about it.
Are you scanning
Yes,
the whole
I am.
language? I know you are.
Yeah.
But I don't
I think
see
I'm
it.
not- no.
Yeah, I don't. In other languages that are here, do you
I
have
think
liability?
susceptibility is, a version of that is in Spanish and French.
What about Anfälligkeit?
That's nice. That's very nice. So, liability. Ihr führt ins Leben uns hinein. And were you going to say that you have liability?
We have in Serbian preemptivos. Something
Sure.
really wide or something.
So it's not that you are guilty, but you're kind of, Husserl would say you'd have an Einstellung or a kind of attitude or openness to being guilty, kind of. Okay, so you bring us into life. Ihr lasst den Armen schuldig werden. You allow the poor ones, the helpless ones, become guilty or indebted. Then you just throw them into pain. What is the real, you mess with them? Then, and every bit of guilt or debt has to be avenged on earth. What is it in English, rather than my?
Then leave repentance fierce to wring us, a moment's guilt in age of woe. It's a kind of terrible translation.
Okay, yeah, mine was even better than that. So even mine was better than that. So here is Freud breaking up his text, or is this where the suture happens? And this is something also that has to be decided by the context and the way the text is operating. Is this an absence of a link? Is there suddenly a gouffre or a chasm or an abyss that gets filled somehow momentarily or by the poetic incursion? Is there something Freud couldn't say or see? So is this covering over an abyss or a wound in the textual elaboration? Or is this the suture that makes everything possible and makes everything move? Okay, I just lost it here. But and this is introduced and interjected, or maybe incorporated, as the moment that says and sees the super-egoical formation and the becoming guilty. You make us guilty. You bring us to life to guilt us. You let us accumulate guilt and debt, which you know is the same word in German, And this is an address, and I just can't go into much more than that. What an address means, whose ear, what's the rhetorical term would be an apostrophe, it's a call out. So Freud is calling out to Goethe in order to cite a call out. And so the, let's say, allegorical dimension, when you do now back up and do a panoramic of this rather than a close-up, is Freud also addressing Goethe? You brought me into life, because this is about also the life of psychoanalysis. You let me name my debt, and my impoverishment, my inability to say. And we're in a relationship of ambivalence that's being thematized here. And that this opening, or and now all the violence that we've been, is this a peaceful moment? Is this a violent intrusion upon, is this an invasion? Was Goethe, and what I've tried to show in the work that I've done on this is what a persecutory figure Goethe was for Freud. So this is not a have a nice text moment. You brought me into a knowledge of my guilt. You messed with me in a fundamental way. You impoverished me. And yet, as we know from Freud and his thinking on trauma that was evoked, trauma is structuring. It's this traumatic invasion that has structured and enabled my thought by disabling me in so many ways. I know that was a drive-by, and maybe we want to open it to conversation, but I wanted to suggest at least provisionally how all of the, or most of the motifs and themes that we've been alerted to today, and you've had the great pleasure of thinking of in this class, are condensed and displaced into, and in a Freudian rhetorical way, into this moment, which you might have thought is very innocent. Oh, how nice, have a deep thought Hallmark card moment with SNL in there. He's quoting a nice poet. No, this is not a nice poet. This is a very, everyone who was in contact with Goethe, everyone, Kafka, Benjamin, everyone flipped out or freaked out or was paralyzed or couldn't write and so on and so forth. And Goethe somehow seeped into their unconscious and debilitated them. In Kafka, in his diaries, will say, oh, I just read Goethe. Great, now I can't write.
Yeah.
That's fuck that, I can't do it. The only one, do you know, who wasn't, who was really immunized and took Goethe as a power pill, would you know who was strong enough for that? Hölderlin was messed up, I think. Do you know the terrible thing? Hölderlin,
Goethe up, I think.
You're right. You're absolutely right. But
Because he was messed up.
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. When you, I'm now on a less deep level. Nietzsche. The only one who could take Goethe and eat him for breakfast and enjoy it, and also was Nietzsche, who loved Goethe without. Nietzsche who discovered the trope of ressentiment, resentment, who he says drives all of our sociality, full of resentment, He said there's one figure who knew how to just wipe off resentment, the way Obama in the early days went like that. I don't know if you remember that gesture when he was really insulted and injured by terribly rude rhetoric of takedown. He just went, which I adopted, at least internally. What? Isn't that what we need? So he said is Goethe. So Nietzsche could affirm Goethe, and Nietzsche experienced Goethe also as his affirmation. Everyone else went down.
If I can just add something here that I think might be another way into the very point you're making about this unbearable kind of entrance of Goethe into the text. It seems to me that at least this citation that we just looked at the end of chapter 7 follows a discussion of instinctual renunciation. So the superego emerges as an instrument that renounces the drives. It renounces sexuality, or it renounces the death drive. But its renunciation is, of course, renunciation is a kind of destruction, or an attempted destruction. Let's call it an attempt, because it can't fully ever destroy. But it's an attempted destruction, and it is a destructive activity. So an operation of the death drive. But what Freud says, I mean, he refers to the superego as intolerant, right? As severe and intolerant, and even, claims that the strength of the superego is the strength of the impulse it is meant to contain, control, or destroy, right? So we have this crazy circularity going on, whereby the more you desire something that is prohibited, the stronger the prohibition becomes, because the prohibition feeds off of it. But there's one point here that I think is really important, and it comes right before this citation. With Freud, Freud talks about the self-beratements of the superego that can be, if left alone, suicidal. Right? So the superego, if left to its own devices, will lead to suicide. And the only thing that keeps it from being suicide is some sexualization or another. So if you're a masochist, that's good, because that's keeping you. Masochism is the alternative to suicide, but the death drive without sexuality has no other way to go but suicide. In any case, yeah, it's something to think about. But here is this moment, and this is what I wanted to say. The building of civilization, which is the institutionalization of these various prohibitions in the name of living together, society, and the rest, involves an increase of the sense of guilt or conscience, right? So hyper-severity, hyper-intolerance. And this will, he says, perhaps reach heights that the individual finds hard to tolerate, which I take to be a kind of euphemism, because what Freud is coming close to is a sense of the radically intolerable, right? A radically intolerable severity. Whether that radically intolerable severity comes from the internal authority, which either has been internalized or which is, the monster fed by the desire it will not permit. But it's the moment in which Freud's language approaches the radical intolerability of guilt, at which point it breaks into a citation of Goethe, and Goethe enters with a language that tries to give some expression to the intolerable precisely where Freud cannot, right? So in some ways Goethe seems to mark the limit of Freud's language for the phenomenon he's trying to broach near. He pulls back, and we might say he requires Goethe to enter and take over that task at that point, as if his own limit is reached precisely there. But in that sense, Goethe does enter the intolerable into Freud's text, right? It is intolerable. It is the intolerable.
And for that, which is magnificently seen and stated, since this is Freud, there will be payback. It's like, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You know, and it's not, as I was saying earlier, it's not, don't forget this is also in the context of remembering the primal horde and totem and taboo and the way the father was murdered. So if Freud invites you in as the father, even though I first went on the off-ramp to say there could be no father, nonetheless, what will be modified by Lacan is the paternal metaphor, which, by the way, a woman can occupy. Anyone can occupy the position of the father. It's not biologically tethered in that way. So if someone is invited in as the father or the figure of the father, that also means that he can expect to be mowed down. There will be a rebellion against that authority. And it's brought in to be knocked down. However, as you know, and this is what Freud is also incorporating his own texts, as you know from Totem and Taboo, right? What ensues after the murder of the father is what he calls remorse.
Yeah.
And that's the beginning of all morality. Remorse. Because now remorse means you really shouldn't have done that. You know, maybe we were a little fast on the trigger. And that means, to just come around back to this, that the father dead and murdered has more authority, even though it's a spectral field from now on. But ask Hamlet, ask anyone who, you know, who's haunted by the paternal metaphor. The father has more authority dead than sitting and drinking beer in front of the TV watching football games, you know? So the problem isn't only the remorse and the guilt that will flood the brothers, the fraternity, but that the father will actually have been pumped up in terms of authority and power. It's now the power father in more political zones, and there's all sorts of trickle-down authority problems henceforth, when the father has been kind of spiritualized into God the Father, or Ghost the Father, or Goethe the Father, or something that comes back as a ghost, as the one who has been murdered. That packs much more of a punch than having let the father hang around and watch him decrease his power over you. Okay, that's a kind of weird paraphrase. It's not the way Freud might have wanted it said, but hey.
One thing that interests me here is that Freud has that kind of extended discussion about whether it matters, does it matter whether the father is killed or not. And he ends up saying that whether one has killed one's father or has abstained from doing so is not really the decisive thing. One is bound to feel guilty in either case, for the sense of guilt is an expression of the conflict due to ambivalence of the external struggle between eros and the drive of destruction or death. And what is interesting to me about guilt at that moment is that guilt doesn't care whether or not you actually killed him. And guilt erases this distinction between, say, an aggression you might feel or fantasize about and one that you actually acted on. Guilt doesn't care. So it doesn't help us make that distinction. So we were talking yesterday about how it might be important ethically to be able to make that distinction between fantasy you have and act you perform, wish you are driven by, and act you abstain from doing. But guilt doesn't care, which means that guilt is not the framework within which that ethical distinction can be thought. Interestingly, guilt works against the ethical in this moment.
And this gets started, this machinery starts up from the so-called omnipotence of thought that a child might have. A child thinks that anything it thinks, like, fuck you, my father said I can't do this, I'm going to do it, you know? That thought itself is so powerfully broadcast that the kid thinks if, God forbid, something happens to the father, he or she willed it. And that's where it comes from. It's a very infantile thing that if I think something bad, it's going to happen, and it's my fault.
Could we talk a little bit more about authority? Because this is a question that we've had here. And I think you've already helped us see a little bit about how Goethe functions as a strange kind of authority. In these final chapters, it seems that Freud is suggesting that that the superego identifies with an authority, or takes what he calls the unattackable authority into itself. Right? So rather than attack authority, it incorporates. I think that might be the term. And sustains a kind of identification with that severe superego. So becoming more like that authority is a way of making sure you don't kill it. Identification kind of takes the place of murder, we might say. But then there's another form of guilt, which is the one that imagines the superego as watching and always living in fear of the superego. So it can be an internal agency that is nevertheless separate from the one who fears it or plots against it or tries to circumvent it or fears punishment by it, right? So there's more of a kind of split structure in that case. But if we were to say, what is Freud telling us about authority? He seems to be saying that it's a misery-making necessary feature of civilization that produces massive suffering or paranoia in relationship to an internalized law. So if we ask, is Freud supporting authority? Is he saying authority is a good thing, we need it? Or is he actually locating it as a source of lethal violence? We might be in the terrible position of saying yes to both, right? Which is the deep pessimism of this text. One of the sites of its what you have called its terrible pessimism.
So tomorrow we'll have an exam on authority. Let me just say two things to kind of off-ramp, and then it'll be your turn. I'll just fast forward to say that, and then perhaps we can get back to this, or maybe there's no return, it's a one-way ticket. Okay, I'll go. I'm jumping now. So there's two things to be said about authority, jumping to Hannah Arendt and Cogent and others, which is, and this would be a link that you might want to really forge and nurture yourselves, which is, you think authority is bad, wait till you have to deal with the disappearance of authority. Again, let's go to the historical intensities with which Freud is battling here. Kojève, Arendt, everyone wanted authority to come in and knock the shit out of those maniac Nazis. If there were a figure of authority who could have walked in instead of those impotent idiots who had no authority. So these people are going to say there was no super-egoical structure anymore. It was like Mad Maxed out. There's the desert and crazy shit going on. And if an authority could have come in and said, knock it off, you idiots, this is not acceptable. That was the wish fulfillment and dream. Let me just say two things. I'll give you two examples and then I'm done. One is an example of authority is phenomenologically not, you can't show it. You can't say, oh, here's authority, here's the substance or something. But here's an example of how it might operate. Let's say someone runs into your office and they're very unwanted. Maybe they're a stalker, maybe they're just a toxic friend or something. And if you call security or make any noise about it, you have no authority. You need help. If you start yelling at the person, you have no authority. But if you were able just to kind of raise your eyebrow a little, even that's too much effort, and the person slithered away, that's called authority. That would be the example, but how do you describe it, philosophically motivated, and so on and so forth. So that's one thing, okay? You understand that authority can't be a show of force. It's not noisy, it's stealth, it can't be fixed or described. It flies under the philosophical radar, beneath that radar. The other thing is who invented authority? Plato, and why? Very easy scheme, which needs to be complicated and deserves much more time, of course. But it's like one of those cop films that are so popular, right? Where the cop lost his partner or her partner, and they're really angry from RoboCop on, you know. So Plato loses Socrates. Socrates is murdered by the state, which, as Hannah Arendt says, the state shows that it's always been on the prowl, okay, not her language, but ready to prey on and finish off the thinkers. So the state has always been hostile, this is Hannah Arendt's vocabulary, to the philosopher. So Plato loses his partner and teacher, Socrates, you remember, famously murdered. And Plato realizes, okay, the rhetoric of persuasion didn't exactly work. We couldn't go up against the state power and violence, and we couldn't persuade them. But on the other hand, we're little wimpy philosophers. We can't arm ourselves against the state, and we don't want to implement a coercive violence. We're philosophers. We, as Kant will say, we shoot blanks. We shoot off our mouths, but we don't shoot, we're not armed, which is, thank God. So when I think of these philosophers,
I don't know if we can speak for everybody.
right? So, so on the one hand, Plato figures out that the rhetoric of persuasion didn't really protect against state violence. On the other hand, they're not going to be able to mobilize coercive violence to protect philosophy. And then he invents, and this is a real condensation, forgive me, so I'm telling a story. It's not false, but it might not be entirely true. It's a fairy tale, but it's true. It might not be the deepest truth. It's what, okay, never mind. So he invents not only hell, by the way, which was supposed to scare the people. So thank you, Plato, for inventing hell. We really needed that in our lives. It was a fiction, a myth. But he also invents authority. And authority is that which supersedes, on the one hand, any rhetoric of negotiation or please, or let me show you, or demonstrate. Authority can stop the violence, and it also doesn't need violence beyond its own legitimation. So that was the way he maneuvered. That from now on, philosophy would carry authority. No one will mess with us again, you know. And that's
You came along.
So those are two very abbreviated stories that might help us think about the impossible aporias that authority tosses us into, which is on the one hand the Freudian, all this authority, the surfeit of authority is crushing our non-existent or existent balls all the time, you know, and it's burdening us, it's encumbering in intolerable ways, and then the Arendt, Kojève, and others, Marcuse, and so on, bring back authority, please God. You know, this is not working. And what happens in all of these texts is that when God is not around to handle the bureaucracy of authority and its important apportionments, then we're all on our own. And the divine has absconded. We're left with a vacant lot, as Hannah Arendt says in different words. And that's where our responsibilities increase, because God isn't taking care of things. He's off duty, or absconded, or dozed off at the wheel or something, asleep at the wheel. So that's when authority becomes very important, when you don't have the transcendental guarantor around. This is what I'm condensing or bringing together Kojève, Arendt, and and Butler in a very fast-tracked way, which is why it becomes upon us to carry so much burden and ethical exemplarity, because the transcendental signifier is absolutely off duty, and then someone has to be taking care of overload and other persecutory consequences that I think you faced beautifully and faced down in so many ways.